Diana Warira is a Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Scholar with the Wilson Center's Africa program and is a communications officer at the African Institute for Development Policy in Kenya. She's been focusing her research on evidence-based policy making. We're going to learn a little more about that. Diana, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you to define definitionally. And we were speaking before we began recording that there is a difference between so-called evidence-based policy making and also evidence-informed. And I think that's the term you prefer.
Right.
So if you would describe what we're talking about.
As I mentioned earlier, of course, we were off camera. It's that for us to think that policies can be evidence-based, I think is a bit unrealistic and a bit naive, because that's saying that the only thing that's I wouldn't say informing, but the only thing that's directing the direction in which policies are taken is evidence. But then evidence-informed policymaking, it means that policymakers are actually considering all the available evidence and looking at what is the best evidence. What does it say? Does it address the challenges we are looking at addressing? Does it give us the right solutions? Is it cost effective? And then if the answer is yes, then that evidence can get into the policy making process, but it's not always guaranteed.
So more shades of gray, so to speak. It's not just black and white.
Yeah.
So and there are other factors than just pure data that go into policy making.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other considerations that evidence competes with?
Well, there's political interests. I think that's the very greatest challenge and the very greatest competing factor. We have personal opinions, we have alliances, we have attitudes and personal values. So evidence is like the very least of the factors that actually inform policy making in most instances, but in a very progressive way of thinking, it should be the very top factor that informs the policy making process.
Do you have a sense that if we think of policy making as a process with a beginning and an end and a lot of steps in between, at what point does evidence become part of the mix? And is it the right point?
Right. First of all, policy making is not linear at all. And usually when you look at it in a cyclic way of evaluation, you're going to realize that we have the shaping stage, we have which we call the initiation or just getting the ideas on the table. And then we have all these other stages that informed the policy design, the implementation, looking at how the policy progressed and whether it's actually going to address the challenges at hand. So all these are steps at which evidence can inform. And I believe, based on experiences, is that setting the policy agenda is the easiest place to get evidence on the table.
At the very beginning.
At the very beginning, I believe, is the easiest place to inform policy.
And are we talking about a particular set of issues, science-based medicine, or are we talking about all issues that can benefit from a so-called evidence-based approach?
I believe all issues can be informed by evidence as long as they have a development focus, as long as we are looking at improving the lives of humans and society. Evidence has a place that it can actually add value to the policy-making process.
I'm really curious to know what you've observed as far as American politics as opposed to what you see back in Kenya, as far as how much adherence there is in the policy-making community to including evidence into the mix.
I know there's a lot of cognizance of the value of evidence in the policy-making process. And as I've spoken to a couple of think tanks here in DC, the kind of work they do, going on the Hill, having these congressional sessions, whether it's testimonies and all that, it's that evidence actually has a place in the policy-making process, but how much they are able to achieve obviously is highly dependent on the politics of the day. So it's not so much the effort from the push side of the researchers and other experts, but also how is the receiving end actually getting the evidence into the policy-making processes. So the acceptance that evidence actually plays a role in policy-making is actually there in the U.S. context.
Are there particular issues, examples that you could provide that are good examples of when evidence is part of the mix in a constructive way, and maybe the other side of that coin, issues where a little more evidence would go a long way and there's some bad public policy as a result of the lack of?
I don't have a very good sense of the U.S. context in terms of policy making.
Really, from any country?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the African context, more so in the Kenyan context. For instance, in terms of the youth agenda in Kenya, there's cognizance of the value that evidence can play in decision making. And again, that's also another part of the conversation, that people are looking at it broader beyond policy making, but also down the program implementation level. And the youth agenda, for instance, now the agency that coordinates population and development issues has actually taken evidence on the demographic dividend to sort of inform planning processes with regard to the youth agenda, because the evidence shows that some of the very problematic issues affecting youth in Kenya is unemployment. Again, that's from studies that have been conducted. And how do we address this unemployment? It's about addressing the skills gaps, creating jobs that are actually gainful to the youth. So it's not about saying we have created 500 jobs, for instance, but it's just ensuring that these jobs are actually gainful for the youth population. So in Kenya, I would say we've made some progress. We are not there yet, but the youth agenda is receiving some attention from the evidence side of things. Yeah.
Well, I remember several years ago, an organization did a study about science reporting. And what they found was that scientists didn't do a good job of communicating to the press, and the press didn't have enough knowledge of science to do a good job in reporting. And so it makes me think about this. Is the onus on the experts who are trying to introduce data into the equation, or is the onus on the policymakers to seek that information? How do you see this working out?
In my view, it's supposed to be a two-way engagement process, and that's why I love the term science communication, which is a whole discipline by itself. So when we talk communication, there are so many aspects of communication, and when I think about science communication, where science reporting actually falls, is that it is this two-way push and pull engagement. So it's not the old school top-down one-way form of communication where experts were the holders of the evidence, quote unquote, or rather the information, and policymakers are just these passive recipients of the evidence. But it's coming to this understanding of what are the needs of the policymakers. We as policymakers, for instance, what do we need? And then if you're on the other side as the expert, what evidence do you have that actually meets the current needs of the policymaker? So it's that give and take and balancing, of course, taking cognizance of these other sensitivities, the politics, the individual interests. So it has to be a two-way engagement process. Yeah.
This whole hashtag fake news has become a thing, and beyond just politicizing facts you don't like, we've also seen Russian disinformation campaigns and other things that could be really problematic for someone who's trying to introduce evidence into the public policy debate. Is this something that you've considered in your studies?
Fake news, I believe it's a global problem right now. So especially with social media, it's very difficult to sieve through the real news and the fake news. And I believe this actually makes evidence the all-time important factor right now in terms of diffusing fake news. And I think right now the onus is on experts to make sure immediately you see a headline, how do you verify? And especially for the media, this is just for them to do a little bit more digging, go to Google, but again ensure that the same Google doesn't end up leading you to the fake news, but also speak to experts where you can get an expert on an issue and verify the information. So fake news is definitely a threat to well-informed policymaking, evidence-informed policymaking, if somebody somewhere doesn't do their job well.
Have you identified a country perhaps, or a government that is utilizing best practices?
In terms of evidence-informed policymaking?
Yeah, or is this sort of case by case? It depends on the time and the politician and whoever else is involved. I'm just wondering, is there any place you've identified that has a tradition of responsibly introducing evidence into the equation when making public policy?
Right. So far, and again, circling back to the demographic dividend agenda that I have been researching on while here at the Wilson Center, is that we do have some progress in some of the countries, for instance, Kenya, Uganda, and Malawi. And especially Malawi being one of the poorest countries in Africa, I would say they've really led the way in terms of taking evidence and using it to inform their policy-making processes. For instance, the recent MDGS, that is the Malawi Growth and Development Strategy for 2017 to 2022, has actually incorporated demographic dividend evidence that has been produced based on the Malawi profile and the challenges they are undergoing right now. And one of the key issues here is that the government has committed to making sure they have adolescent sexual and reproductive health services. And I know there are very many controversies on comprehensive sexuality education, but they've actually taken the recommendations from the evidence and gotten it into these development planning processes. So I believe Malawi is leading the way. Of course, there are challenges at that country level, but it's basically showing that when evidence informs the development planning and policy making processes, of course, this has to be implemented for us to actually say, this is the success. So for now, we can only wait and see what happens. But I believe getting it into the development planning process is actually a necessary first step for countries to progress.
Is there enough investment in the whole generation of evidence and ideas? I mean, we're sitting in a Washington think tank, in a community of think tanks. There are things like the Congressional Budget Office that the federal government uses as a nonpartisan tool to sort through economic matters. Is there enough activity of the sort that generates the type of evidence that would fuel the process that you're describing?
At government level, I wouldn't say I have witnessed agencies that are particularly charged with that task of generating evidence to inform policy per se. But for instance, in Kenya, we have the Parliamentary Research Services, which again has identified that they have a role to play in the evidence-informed policymaking conversation in Kenya, and they're collaborating with different actors on how they can build their skills. How can the researchers conduct better research? How can they engage with policymakers in the legislative bodies of Kenya? And how can they actually use the evidence they are generating to ensure it's actually informing the policymaking processes? So I would say a lot of the work is being done by think tanks on the continent, and it's interesting that they are collaborating with these government agencies. So there's that cognizance of the value of partnering with government and not having these silos conversation as the non-state actors, so to speak, but collaboration and close relationships with government actually does better as opposed to doing your thing on the side as non-state actors. Yeah.
So your term at the Wilson Center coming to a close in a couple of weeks. What's next for you, and what's next for this research? Will you be making recommendations when you return to Kenya?
Yeah, definitely. I know I've drawn a lot of lessons from the US context on how we can improve on what we are doing back in Kenya and back in Africa, because as I mentioned, my home institution is doing research across different countries on the continent. And even beyond the demographic dividend agenda, I believe even other sectors can actually benefit from these best practices of actually taking up evidence, assessing it, and of course creating these very close relationships with policymakers. And in terms of the work and the recommendations that I'm going to be drawing from my research in a few weeks, is that I'm going to have these sessions and just sort of create conversation with both the producers of evidence and the users of evidence, and just having this single conversation and ensuring that everybody understands what their role is, and that evidence-informed policymaking is not a non-state actor role. And again, policymakers have a place on the table, and they're the ones who actually should be driving the agenda, and because that's more sustainable if they have buy-in and they get into the driver's seat.
Well, thank you. It's important work, and I'm glad we were able to supply a home for your work, at least for a temporary time. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on the show.
Wish you continued success.
Thank you so much.